All right. Thank you all for being here for our second town hall on political values and faith values. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to put their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of this screen and not the chat box, so that our panelists are able to see the questions a little easier. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce our moderator, David Curry. David is a rancher, builder, and minister who currently serves on the board for Pastors for Texas Children and the Interfaith Alliance Board. With a PhD in Christian ethics from Southwestern Baptist Theology Seminary, David believes the values of the Democratic Party most closely resemble his Baptist faith, which led him down the path of political involvement as chair of the Tom Green County Democratic Party, as well as chair of the non-urban rural caucus for the Texas Democratic Party. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate that. She mentioned my Baptist faith. My Baptist faith is grounded in the fact that this country has a First Amendment because of some Baptist preachers in the 1700s that demanded that James Madison and others carried to the Constitutional Convention what became the First Amendment to the Constitution for religious liberty. And as I start this tonight, and before I even introduce our panelists, I want you to hear me say, I'm more concerned at this moment in time about the future of the country my grandchildren will grow up in than I've ever been in my 67 years. This Supreme Court appointment could destroy religious liberty as we have known it. And in my opinion, what makes America, America is the First Amendment to the Constitution. To speak to some of these issues and how it affects public education and other things, we have a great panel. Rabbi Jack Moline and I have been friends for over 20 years. He is president of the Interfaith Alliance. I've served on that board for over 20 years. He's been a rabbi for 38 years. One of the most spiritual experiences I ever had, Jack, was, what was that meal on Friday night that we had at your house?
Shabbat dinner.
What do you call that?
Shabbat dinner.
And being there with his family that they do every Friday night. They speak scripture to each other, his two children. My wife and I were there, I guess 20 years ago, because I remember talking about ER, so it was on. You were willing to do anything as long as you didn't miss ER. I guess that was before you could video everything. But Rabbi Moline, and the last thing I'll say about Jack is he's a Cubs fan. He grew up in Chicago. Loves the Cubs. Thank God they finally won the World Series so Jack could have a little bit of peace in his life. So he'll be with us. Mike Collier's with us again. As you know, Mike was a Republican. He was a CPA. But for us now, he's become sort of the conscience of the Democratic Party, trying to encourage folks to realize, you know, I told somebody the other day, for every one crazy Democrat, there's now 100 crazy Republicans. And I don't think people realize that. And I'm pretty bipartisan. I've always tried to work with everybody. But when you get the Tea Party and the religious right, you're pretty out there. And Mike is a former Republican. He ran for comptroller in 2014 and for lieutenant governor, and I hope he runs again because Texas needs him. We also have Charles Luke, who is co-director of the Pastors for Texas Children, whose board I serve on. He's a former Texas public school superintendent. I think he's a former pastor as well, Charles, correct me if I'm wrong. He is director of the Coalition for Education Funding, a group of 79 Texas independent school districts that work together to secure adequate and equitable funding for Texas public schools. And he works as co-director of Pastors for Texas Children, statewide public education advocacy group. And he's the coordinator of the Coalition for Public Schools. So he's very active in trying to support public education in Texas. And our final guest tonight is Bea Moorhead, who is the executive director of Texas Impact since 2000, managing every aspect of the organization's work, answering to a 60-member board of directors, as well as a 12-member board of the Texas Interfaith Center, much like the Interfaith Alliance. And she is working very closely on these issues that we as Christians and people of faith, of all faiths, can coalesce around to try to make this a better state and a better country. So we've got a great panel tonight, and I appreciate you being here. Rabbi Moline, the Interfaith Alliance, you and I have worked together for over 20 years. The First Amendment is our first commitment at the Interfaith Alliance. Would you speak to the dangers we face at the First Amendment at this point in time?
Well, David, I first of all, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel and to sit with these wonderful folks. It's a lot easier to be together with them than it was the last time we visited, when I had to find my way to San Angelo, which was a long haul for a very intense but wonderful experience.
Goats miss you, Jack.
The goats and the sheep, and not to mention
And the llamas.
the llama, yeah, of blessed memory. So David and I have been engaged in Interfaith Alliance work for more than 2 decades now, and formed a real bond there. He and I probably had about as different upbringings as 2 human beings in the United States might have had, except for the fact that we both speak some version of English. We're both baseball fans, and we're both committed to the First Amendment. I doubt you would find a whole lot that we have in common, but that last commitment, that First Amendment commitment, is the one that I think is most important, because I agree, without the freedom of conscience that's guaranteed by the First Amendment, and without keeping the government out of the business of religion, we would not have the America that made it possible for us to grow up in such diverse circumstances and still feel a sense of kinship, being a part of that unum that is created by the pluribus that our national motto brings together. We're very concerned, as everyone is, about what's going to happen to the Supreme Court now that Justice Ginsburg is no longer able to occupy her seat. And today, Interfaith Alliance issued a memorial post in her memory. It pains me, especially since we lost her on the eve of the Sabbath and on the eve of the Jewish New Year, that before her body was cold, there was already positioning being done politically on how to fill that seat. And that it looks like her dying wish that the next person elected president be the one to nominate her replacement, that's going to be ignored, and that it's even been called bogus by the current occupant of the Oval Office. So we know that there are some questions that need to be asked. Whoever the nominee is has to be asked about what role their faith plays in their judicial philosophy. They have to be asked about how they understand the Establishment Clause. They have to be asked about whether the Free Exercise Clause allows people to supersede the rights of others based on their personal beliefs. That's going to be a critical question. They have to be asked about whether taxpayer dollars should be allowed to fund what I guess we can call mission activities for religious institutions. We're already seeing the danger of that with the monies that have been distributed to help sustain people through this awful pandemic that we're going through. Millions of dollars of which have gone to pay clergy salaries and expenses for houses of worship around the country, while good folks who need that assistance are often having trouble getting their hands on what the government is there to do, which is to sustain people in need. So Interfaith Alliance and I know David, and I'm sure everyone who's listening, stands firmly committed to the notion that we need to have a government, all 3 branches, that respect the separation of religion and government, the separation of church and state, and that protects the rights of everybody, people who think like us and people who don't think like us, people who are faithful in their own way and people who don't profess a faith, to have the freedom of conscience and to comport themselves in a manner that allows them the maximum amount of freedom with the minimum interference with anybody else's civil and human rights.
Jack, thank you. Well said. Interfaith Alliance folks, if you're not a contributor to this organization, if you're not a follower of this organization, please do so now. We
Thank
were
you.
founded over 20 years ago as an alternative to the religious right. Jack and I have been on the board since nearly its inception, and the fight will never end. There are always folks that want to control people and what they can believe and not believe, and what they can do and what not do in the name of their faith. But I'm here to tell you, I live in a state where I have a senator named Ted Cruz who does not believe in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. And I don't care if he claims to be a constitutionalist. What they understand the First Amendment to mean is protect their religious liberty to practice hate and practice discrimination in the name of Jesus. And that is not what the First Amendment is about. And it is what has kept us from killing each other in this country and having all the wars that are fought all over the rest of the world over religion. And so this is a passionate fight we must all join. Mike Collier, we're going to stay with this same theme as I come to you, our former candidate for lieutenant governor and the senior advisor to the Biden campaign. Mike, one of the other biggest threats facing the Supreme Court with this appointment is the Affordable Care Act going to survive? And you've been a passionate, you need to unmute yourself, Mike. You have been a passionate supporter of expanded health care, expanding Medicare, of how important it is to provide health care to people in this state. So Mike, speak to us about how out of your faith you have this passion for health care and other issues that you'd like to speak to.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David. Once again, it's good to see you. And Charles and Jack, it's good to meet you. And B, thank you for allowing me to say a few words. Yeah, so my reaction to the Supreme Court situation, the very first thing that came into my mind was pre-existing conditions. Now, I think that healthcare is a fundamental human right. And I see that all over the Bible that I read. I can't imagine that anybody who draws from the well of faith could reach any other conclusion. We have such unbelievable technology at our fingertips. How could it possibly be that a moral person would allow some to have access but not others? So I think that healthcare is a fundamental human right. I think it has a moral foundation, and I think it's appropriate that policymakers keep that in mind and to work on it. Now, within the Affordable Care Act is protections for people with pre-existing conditions. That's under attack. Ken Paxton is leading this. Donald Trump has chosen not to defend our federal law, and it will make it to the Supreme Court. And I'm told that the Supreme Court will rule on this on November 10th. And so if Paxton is successful and the Affordable Care Act is shut down by the Supreme Court, then Americans with pre-existing conditions will very quickly, perhaps immediately, find themselves without health insurance. That's 4 million Texans could sit down to Thanksgiving with that having just lost their health care, which is so wrong. And I would also say that the Constitution, the clear intent of the Constitution is that the Americans will select the president, and the president will select the Supreme Court justice. Therefore, we should not be choosing a justice now. And you know who agrees with that or agreed with it was Senator Cruz and Senator Cornyn. And they dealt with this in an authoritative way 4 years ago, made their point of view very clear. They were stood on principle, and now they have reversed themselves because politics and power will do that to a person who's not grounded in principle. And I hope that Cornyn is defeated for that purpose as well. So I think there's an awful lot to worry about. Religious liberty, absolutely. I'm very concerned about that. As we discussed the last time I was on this program, after we lost pretty big in 2014, the party asked me to go around the state and talk to folks about what do Democrats need to do to be successful in the state. And I mentioned there's a statement of fact that Democrats are every bit as men and women of faith as Republicans. It's just that we have the intellectual elasticity to accept two things: that there's more than one faith, or for some none, and that we need to separate church and faith. But it's wrong to say that we are anti-faith. It's wrong to say that we are anti-God. And our construction of religious liberty is very consistent with my growing up as a Catholic, which is my relationship with God is entirely my business. And your relationship with your God is entirely your business. I'm not to meddle in your relationship. I can witness, I can set a good example, I can live my life in a moral way, but it's my business and mine alone. And the separation of church and state is very much consistent with that point of view. So, but back to healthcare, I'm very concerned about what happens if we have a Supreme Court justice rush through, they vote, and they kill the Affordable Care Act, and folks with pre-existing conditions suddenly find themselves in the middle of a pandemic, suddenly find themselves without health care. The anxiety that will work on so many families is just almost too much to comprehend. And how could anybody point to that and say that that's consistent with their faith upbringing and moral righteousness? Can't.
Well, you can't, Mike, and I appreciate you bringing that up. And you're absolutely right. For folks that say, well, if you're a Democrat, you're anti-God. I'm 67 years old, and I started in high school caring about these issues. So my whole life has been about trying to apply my faith to the society in which I lived and how to make it a better place. And that involves religious liberty, it involves healthcare, involves public education, it involves the environment. You know, I'm a rancher. You know, I got 70 goats right outside the door here. I got 100 cows at Paint Rock. I got 200 sheep. But that piece of dirt out there doesn't belong to me. It belongs to God. I'm a steward of it for right now. And my grandfather was, and my great-grandfather was, as well as my father. And I've got kids and grandkids, and they're all going to be stewards of that piece of dirt that in Hebrew, and Jack knows more about this than I do, was very much part of their social fabric. It was not a financial issue as much as a personal issue, that piece of. So we come to this out of a position of faith, and that's what we're trying to tell folks, that if you're a Democrat, it doesn't mean you're anti-God. It means you've really read the scriptures and you understand what it means to love your neighbor as yourself and try to create a better society. Two people that work extremely hard at that right now are B. Moorhead and Charles Luke. B, I'm going to ask you to speak about what Texas Impact does. So unmute yourself, please.
All right.
And talk to us about the work you're doing in Austin and with the Texas legislature to put faith. You know, when I was at the Christian Life Commission way back in the 70s, we had a poster that says, citizenship is putting feet to your prayers. And that is, you don't just pray for change, you get up and work for change. Putting feet to your prayers is what it means to be a citizen. B. Moorhead's done that for 20 years now at Texas Impact. And B, talk to us about what you're doing to make Texas a better place in the name of God.
Well, thanks for having me. And I know last time you had Josh Houston from my staff, and I don't really know what all he may have talked about. So I apologize if I'm going over the same material and you get the same people on the call or whatever. But Texas Impact exists to bridge the gap for people of all faiths in Texas between what we would describe as charity and justice. So we exist to help people of all faiths take the lived experience that they have in their faith tradition, whatever it is, and use that experience and the understanding that they have to influence public policies on behalf of people who are all of our shared faith traditions call us to care about, the people who are marginalized, people who are vulnerable, and to work for freedom and opportunity and justice for all people. when I first got this job, one of the things that was hard for me to understand, and it's usually hard for people who aren't familiar to understand, is how it could be that if you look at the religious spectrum, and Texas is a very religiously diverse place. That's something that people don't always understand. They think about Texas and they think about, that buckle in the Bible belt kind of, description. And they don't understand that Texas is hugely religiously diverse. Houston, Texas is the most religiously diverse big city in the United States. And there's more than 80 or 100 religions practiced in Houston. And people think about that and they think, well, how would it be possible that all those religious traditions would come down on the same side on so many issues? If you think everywhere from the ways we raise money in state government, so different kinds of taxes, to major kinds of programs like healthcare, like Mike, you're talking about, in education, to the way that we regulate businesses, and the way that we honor each other's religious ability, capacity to have our own religious values. It doesn't seem probable that, given so much variation and such difference as far as we can tell in all those religions, that they could all agree on anything. And yet, on issue after issue after issue after issue, it turns out that they do. It turns out, and the way Texas Impact functions is, we have, as David said, this huge board that are delegates from all the different faith traditions that participate, and they make a legislative agenda. They actually just did that at the end of last month, so about, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's voted on, and it has to be unanimous. So it's a consensus agenda. And the legislative agenda that they passed last month is not any different from any of the other ones. It's a huge range of issues where what the board members do is go back to their national principles or their, have broadly taught social teachings, and confirm that the Texas Impact legislative agenda doesn't conflict with any of those, or national denominational statements, or the statement of the RAC, for example, for the Jewish community. The issues range from, like I said, from taxes to education and health, and poverty issues, living wages, climate change, energy, human migration, including, economic migration and asylum and refugees. I mean, it's just across the board. So I think what's really important for people who are participating in this, who are watching this conversation, I think what's really important to remember when you see media, or when you're told information that the religious community can't agree about anything, and that it's necessary to pick one side or another according to your faith, demonstrably the answer to that is it's not necessary. The people of Texas have found ways to be in relationship with each other and to agree about a lot of things, and you can resist the outside call to use religion as a fragmenting force. You don't have to succumb to that. So I'll stop there.
B, thank you, B. Your last statement is so true, that everything about our society right now tries to create us versus them. I fall into it. We all fall into it. But we've forgotten that you have to have mutual respect. There are people that disagree with us, and they're still good people. Some of them, I remember Dr. Martin Luther King's statement, a lot of people do things not out of human badness, but out of human blindness. They just don't understand what's at stake and they've had limited exposure. And, you know, I try to think about, you know, Jack and I talked about how we grew up differently. Jack's from Chicago. I had a high school graduating class of 5. And yes, I will admit, as one of my favorite lines as I go speak across the country has been, I was the top 20% of my class. I'm very proud of that. But you know, I mean, how diverse can you get between growing up in Chicago and having a high school graduating class of 5? But Jack and I, and the reason Mike and I have connected, and the reason Charles and I now work together is because we share this passion for what it means to take your faith and try to make the world a better place, and yet understand that people that don't see like we do yet, a lot of them they just don't understand. And they've been fed easy answers. I mean, black and white things. You know, let me talk about abortion for a minute, because that's one of the biggest issues in the religious community and in the rural community. And there are people that think if you just overturn Roe versus Wade, boom, abortion's over in this country. Folks, overturning Roe versus Wade will be about as effective in ending abortion as prohibition was in stopping drinking. Several years ago, my youngest son and his wife and my wife and I went to Chicago, and they said Al Capone had like 2,400 speakeasies, and now there's only 1,200 bars in Chicago compared to what that was. Now, Jack, you're from Chicago. You may be able to respond to that. But the fact is, Roe versus Wade's going to accomplish nothing. If they overturn it, they're going to accomplish nothing. I am a pro-life Democrat, but that's a spiritual issue that the government needs to stay out of, in my opinion. But the fact is that just removes it to the states. If you've got money, you get on an airplane, fly to California, fly to New York, fly wherever abortion is illegal, get an abortion. The people that will suffer are poor people, 15-year-olds that got raped. This is a very complicated issue, and the facts are Democratic programs that increase the economy, increase the access to contraceptives, help reduce abortions more than Republican policies. Study the facts. It's kind of like economics. I get so frustrated. People say, well, I'm a Republican because the economy does better. Oh, really? Carter, Clinton, Obama, 44,000 jobs. Reagan, Bush, less than 20 million jobs. 44 million jobs versus 20 million jobs. The economy always does better under Democratic leadership, and people refuse to acknowledge that. So, Mike, I see you're not on mute. You want to say something about what I'm saying? Because
yeah, I do.
Was published
I'm not afraid to.
Yeah, talk about that.
I'm not afraid to. In fact, I'd like to comment on this abortion issue because, you know, I didn't have a chance to debate when I ran against Dan Patrick. I didn't have a chance to debate him because he wouldn't turn out. So I didn't get a chance to say what I think needs to be said, which is the only power available to a political leader on this issue is the power to invest in education, the power to invest in adoption, for some contraception, to reduce the need to potentially zero. The only power available to a political leader with regard to abortion is power that Republicans refuse to use. And in contrast, Democrats are quite ready to invest in education and adoption, and for some, contraception. We're quite prepared to use that power. And I would have said to Dan Patrick, if you were so anti-abortion as you say you are, you would sign up to my program. And I believe that logic holds even if we find ourselves in a situation with Roe v. Wade overturned, because as Mr. Curry says, I don't think that really changes anything. The power that's available to us is in education and adoption, and for some, contraception, and that's the power that we should use as it relates to abortion, in my opinion. Thank you for allowing me to say that, David.
Thank you, Mike. And the fact is, you and I are males, and we don't actually know anything about that per se. And we need to be sensitive to that as well. What does it mean to be a woman? The simplicity that so many people try to deal with this issue with is offensive, to be honest with you. It is very complicated. I have no clue why, as a Howard Payne freshman, I had a young lady I became friends with who got an abortion, and she decided to confide in me. You know, a guy who showed up on a track scholarship with a high school graduating class of 5. And she went on and married the man, had a child, went on with a great life. For some reason, she trusted me, and maybe it was she felt I've got some phone ringing for some reason. I thought it was on silent. Anyway, I'll ignore it. That I was a person she could talk to, and I appreciate that. And it's a good memory of 50 years now. But it's a very complicated issue, and people should have a lot more compassion than what they do. Charles Luke, please unmute yourself. I've been on your board longer than I remember as well, just kind of like Jack Moline. Charlie Johnson and you had pastors for Texas Children, and now pastors for Mississippi Children and Kentucky Children. And I don't know where all we are now, Charles. I just know we're expanding across the country because people are realizing that the first role of government is public education. The Texas Constitution says that. And I keep telling people, my Republican friends, because of abortion or guns, and I own 27 of them, and nobody's going to ever take away any of them. It's just a stupid issue. They get you to vote to close your public school when neither one of those issues are really even, it should be in your top 100, because neither one are going to be changed by government. But public education is the most important thing government does. So I see we've got a question. I'll look at it. Charles, you talk to us about the work of Pastors for Texas Children.
Okay, thank you, David. I'd be glad to. So as you say, I think one of the very first places that we interface with the concept of the separation of church and state, which, by the way, I was told by a senator from the Valley area in a hearing during the last session or the session before, that when I cited separation of church and state, he said, you know, Dr. Luke, he's very kind to me. He said, Dr. Luke, I have to be very kind. I don't want to chide you, but separation of state is nowhere in the Constitution. And I said, well, my 8th grade civics teacher will be shocked to learn that, because Senator, he saw the same thing that Thomas Jefferson saw, and that was the dynamic tension between the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. And he saw that was the wall of separation that creates the concept of the separation of church and state. Literalists very often don't get abstract higher concepts like that something may not be specifically stated in verbatim in the same words that is used to describe the concept later, but the concept is in the document. And that's one of the things we battle all the time. Well, a battleground for the separation of church and state is definitely our public schools. We've seen it recently. You mentioned at the beginning of this that if we're, a lot hangs in the balance with the next Supreme Court appointment. We saw Espinoza versus Montana decided a couple of months ago, where it was decided by the Supreme Court that if a state adopted a voucher-like program, education savings account or something like that, they were not able to now exclude religious institutions in that. What I often remind my very conservative evangelical fundamentalist friends, which I have a few, is that that doesn't just include them. That includes our Jewish brothers, our Muslim brothers, and lots and lots and lots of other folks as well. So when we open that up and we say that we're going to fund religious institutions of learning, then we open it to lots and lots of different people. Jimmy Don Aycock, when he was the chair of the Texas House Public Education Committee, used to always cite a Wiccan school that existed in San Antonio, and he plagued his colleagues with that constantly. How many of you are in favor of funding the Wiccan school? So that is a huge issue, and it is the battleground and the forefront of the battleground for privatization efforts in the state. There's a huge effort to, and it's been ongoing for years, starting with in response to Brown versus Board of Education and desegregation, the Supreme Court decision on desegregation. Immediately schools or states started creating a way to maintain segregation. And some of those were freedom schools and things of that nature, obviously a misnomer, but they were ways to say, hey, what we'll do is we'll opt into private schools and we'll fund those another way with a voucher or something else. One, I think it was Prince Edward County and in North Carolina, is that where it is? Actually shut down their school system for quite a while, for like 2 years, rather than integrate their schools. So we've seen all kinds of historical issues, the desire to privatize public schools, to create a parallel system with vouchers, is tied inextricably to a desire to segregate white kids away from kids of color. And that's just the way it is. I mean, there's really no question about that for anybody who just digs a little bit into the history of all of this. Typically, when vouchers are instituted, they favor a specific religion, though. And so in the case of a place like Indiana, for example, where vouchers were promised to never grow more than 1% of the total state education budget, but today account for about 10% of it. Those states, typically there's one or two faith orientations that are favored. In that case, it's the Lutheran churches and the Catholic churches. And so, you know, I was visiting with one of the folks in the Liberty wing of the legislature of the Texas Capitol. You guys know what the Liberty wing is, right? I mean, that's where all the state representatives are packing heat. They've all got a sidearm strapped on, you know, because they're open carry guys and all that stuff. And so I was visiting with one of their chief of staff in the last legislative session, and she said to me, we need to bring back our public schools to where they are under God's law and not man's law. And I said, well, let me ask you, I said, who determines what God's law is? Well, it's the Bible. And I said, well, that's fine, but I've got a certain interpretation and you've got a different interpretation. And then there's another person over here who's got a third interpretation, and on it goes. So whose interpretation do we use to determine what God's law is? And I said to her, I said, I'm guessing that we're probably going to use your interpretation, right? Because you want to be the one to call the shots. Now, David, you mentioned Baptists early on, and that's my heritage. I grew up as a Baptist in Oklahoma, and historically, whenever we have churches and states lying down in bed together, that hasn't worked very well for my folks. We always are the ones that are boiled in oil or burnt at the stake, and so I'm not really ready to go back to that. We do have a name for a time. We've tried this before. We've tried where the church and the state were tied together, and we've got a term for that. We call it the Dark Ages. So I'm not real crazy about going back to something of that nature. This next election, you mentioned a little bit about the election cycle. In 2018, in Texas, I would say one thing about Mike Collier, who's on the call here, that along with Beto O'Rourke and some other people who ran on the Democratic ticket that didn't win, they did affect down ballot races significantly. So we saw 12 seats move from the Republican category to the Democratic category in the Texas House of Representatives. And we saw a much more moderated legislature as a result. The Senate's pretty far right, run by Lieutenant Governor Patrick. And so we passed a historic piece of school funding legislation, right? I mean, think about that. 2018 happened, and then 2019 happened, where we actually were able to get $6.5 billion infused into our public schools. And that's a direct result of 2018. Right now, I think we're going to see in Texas a more moderated House. Even conservative estimates are saying that the Democrats will pick up 6 seats. Well, added to what they've already got. They're obviously hoping to pick up more than that to flip the Texas House. I believe in I'm a moderate person, and so I believe in rational, moderate approaches to things. So we've had an extreme right orientation in Texas for a long, long time. It's led to some of the problems that you guys have already talked about on here in healthcare and lots of other ways. It's time for us to adopt a more rational approach. And if the Democrats win the House, then whether or not you're a Democrat or Republican, if the Democrats win the House, that moderate stance will be more solidified than it would be otherwise.
David, you might
Charles, wouldn't you say that the reason we got $6 million for public education is because the Democrats won 12 seats in the House?
Yeah, I would say that it's, I'm not a statistician, but it's at least correlative. I think that it got some people's attention in the Texas House of Representatives. And, if you're thinking about how this shifts to a more reasonable approach, and that's what I call it. I don't say it's Democrat or Republican. I say it's, it's reasonable. We need reasonable government.
Yeah.
And
we need reasonable Republicans.
And we've got a Democrat politician on the call, Mike Collier, and I support Mike because Mike's a reasonable person with strong solutions, and his solutions are grounded in reality, not some fantastical mythology that he's dreamt up. So I think that I think it's definitely correlative. If the House flips, we're going to see even more moderation of the Senate. It's always going to go, closest to the ground and then change. So it's changed the House. It's easier to change a House seat than it is to change a Senate seat, but all of this stuff will flow. So it's a good thing to see Texas turn purple. That's a good color.
Yeah, means we're cooperating. Mike Collier, you wanted to say something? Go ahead, my friend.
Well, first of all, I just have to say, bid my farewells because I have another Zoom that I have to go to. We're getting close to Election Day, but I wanted to say, key off on something that Dr. Luke said. The redistricting is coming up. And I think that also had an impact on why the legislature, the Republicans in the legislature put money into public education last time, because they lost 12 seats, lose 9 more, they lose the House. If they lose the House, they can't redistrict. If they can redistrict, then they can play a much stronger hand again. And I think they'll go right back to cutting public education from whence they came. Because I do not believe a leopard changes their spots. And I know that Dan Patrick took a lot of heat from his base for bowing to public education. And I think he did it for one session and one session only to try to not lose the House so that they can redistrict. And for those of us who think that public education is a moral imperative, and I believe it is a moral imperative, then we've got to fight like the devil, pardon the pun, to make sure that we win the House so that we don't get redistricted out of power. Because I think if we're redistricted out of power, then I think they will indeed try to dismantle public education. They almost got there, and I think they'll try to do it. I wish I could stay, David, and Charles and
Well,
Jack.
thank you, Mike. I appreciate you being on again. I look forward to seeing you. I look forward to seeing you in San Angelo, October the 1st.
We'll see you on October the 1st.
Zoom rally for Joe Biden here, and Mike's going to be in my office.
Looking
I want to
forward.
remind folks that are watching this, Jerry Falwell Sr., I think Junior may have split his britches, so to speak, but Jerry Falwell Sr. said, "I look forward to the day there is not a single public school in America." That is a direct quote. That is the agenda of the religious right. That is the agenda of the folks pushing to put a religious right person on the Supreme Court, to destroy public education. That is the ultimate goal of the religious right. While I'm talking here, I thought I saw a couple of, Julie Haldeman. Julie, aren't you running for public office? Can I
Julie's
get
county
you
chair in
up on the
Van
screen?
County.
Oh,
Julie's
okay.
a county chair.
Well, I knew I recognized her name, and Van Zant. Now, here's the story for you, Julie, and I told you this when I met you. One of my mentors was Foy Valentine, head of the Southern Baptist Christian Life Commission, who is from Van and is buried in Van. And he was one of the persons who worked with my buddy Will Campbell and others, and met with white citizens councils and others, and fought for religious liberty and for the end of racism in this country and Jim Crow laws, when Southern Baptists actually cared about such things. You
And
have a
served
real
on the
hero
board of
from
Interfaith
Van Zandt
Alliance for
County.
many years.
Yep, he's the one who said to me, Jack, David, you need to come on the Interfaith Alliance board. So he is who brought me on. Jack, I want you to unmute again and speak to some broader issues that the Interfaith Alliance is speaking to. Because we care about public education, we care about religious liberty, we care about LGBTQ rights, because they're just human rights. So speak to us about some of the other things we're doing at the Interfaith Alliance.
I'm glad you asked me to jump in on public education. I want to make clear that I never went to a majority Jewish school until I entered seminary to study to be a rabbi. I had a public school education from kindergarten through high school. Unlike David's high school, my high school had 3,000 students in it. And though I wasn't without Jewish friends, there was no time when I felt like my community was in control of the public schools. And here I am, a committed Jew, talking to you all about the value of America, not because I'm interested in it being Jewish, but because it protects my being Jewish, someone else being Christian, someone else being Muslim, someone else being an atheist. That is what I learned about when I was in public school, the value of a collective America. And what I've seen, particularly as I've become a little more aware of the world around me and out of the rarefied environment where I grew up, what I've seen is that those public schools that are given the resources that are necessary to educate all of their students produce people just like the folks on this panel discussion, people who are committed to their own values that they learn in their homes, people who are committed to the civic values that are promoted by public education. Every dollar that's taken out of the public schools and put into the optional private decision, private schools that parents and children have a right to patronize, takes away money from that American dream, takes away resources from training the next generation of American citizens, takes money away from the teachers and the custodians and the administrators and the football coaches and the dramatic club directors, takes away the money that creates the well-rounded people that help to support this society in which we can all thrive. Interfaith Alliance is deeply devoted to full funding of public education and deeply opposed to the notion that tax dollars, whether they're federal, state, or local, be diverted from public education to private, and particularly private religious education, because the essence of America is in the hands of the children who are educated in what America is all about. And if children are in a school that teaches them that American values are secondary to whatever they're learning in their Bible class or their catechism class or their Talmud class, if it teaches them that there is something that is secondary about the Constitution, it puts them in danger, it puts all of us in danger. That's one of the most important issues that we focused on. BIC, you got something to say about that too.
Yeah, I would just love to weigh in for a second and say, I mean, two quick things. First of all, I think that one of the reasons that faith communities across the board support public education so strongly is that faith communities are the originators of the idea of education as a way that we raise up our next generation. And the reason that we raise them up through an education system like the American public school system, and this is, I remember being in the student government at the University of Texas when I was there, and there's a room where the Board of Regents meets, and it's got up around the ceiling, there are all these, like famous sayings by the fathers of Texas. And one of them that it would kind of catch my eye was that the reason that we have the public university systems and public school systems is to raise the next generation of citizens. It's to so that we can govern ourselves. So the notion that any one faith tradition would get to carve out public dollars to do some other form of training kind of flies in the face of that idea that what we're all trying to do is raise the next generation of citizens. But the other thing I want to say really quickly is there was a woman who, I bet David and Charles that you will remember Ernestine Glossbrenner. And when I started to go to faith school, she spoke on the first day. She was one of the people that Max Sherman had come in and talk to us about sort of what it was like in real life. And she talked about being a school teacher. And she said, when I first started being a teacher, if you weren't sort of exactly the right kind of child, you didn't get to go to public school. If you were too poor, your family was from the wrong side of the tracks, or you were the wrong color, or you were the wrong religion in some cases, you didn't get to come. And she said, we have grown as a country, we've grown as a state, and we understand more and more that everyone has to be included. And I guess I just want to, maybe Jack, I especially want to say, it seems like part of the whole exercise is the community of Texas and the community of the United States having to go through this process of learning over and over that it's not just that we all do better when we all do better, it's that we won't be able, any of us, to do well if we deliberately put in place systems that keep one group from getting as good as another group. So, I don't think it's just an issue of, I know that separation of church and state is not sort of just an issue of separation of church and state, But I mean, I think there is also this basic idea of what kind of a country we want to be, and I just hope that we're not making public school funding into kind of a duality of either we're for public schools and we're against vouchers, or we're for vouchers and we're against public schools. That there is a complexity about why we have public school that I think Jack was alluding to in a lot of the stuff that he was saying, and it's important for Texans to affirm that, as we have done since 1876, when the University of Texas was founded.
You know, it's an interesting story, and I wish I could remember the specifics, but back in my Baptist committed days, I remember reading a story where a guy came to America from Ireland. And as you know, the history of Ireland, it's the Protestants and the Catholics. And he said, you know, the genius of America is your public schools, because in our school system, from the day they start kindergarten, they are taught to hate the Catholics or hate the Protestants. Your public school system does away with that. Your public school system teaches everybody to respect everybody. And that's my biggest fear about what's happening in America right now, is not liberal, conservative, left, right, Democrat, Republican. It's that we're being taught that they're good guys and bad guys, or girls, or women, or whatever positions. And we're not being taught that the kingdom of God is where people love each other, whether it's Jews, Muslims, Catholics, Baptists, whatever. We love each other. We care about each other. Our public school system is a part of the genius of America. Religious liberty is at the heart of the genius of America, where we respect people who don't think like we do and cooperate for the greater good, which is freedom. Now, do we have problems? Oh my God, the racism issues in this country coming to surface, folks, they're real. Okay, these folks that are marching, they're marching because I didn't tell Lance and Chad Curry, who are now 41 and 39, when they left the house in high school, how to handle themselves if the cops pull them over. And one of those dumb kids walked out to a cop car out on a cotton field with his beer can in his hand when he was 17, and he got an MIP. And so I had to go to court and say, he's a good kid, he just screwed up. But I didn't have to worry about him getting shot like black parents do. And I speak to that as someone that doesn't even understand what I'm talking about. And when I hear other people think, oh, this is so simple. No, it's not simple. But the fact is, this country has pulled together through all kinds of things to survive. And the biggest reason we survive is tolerance, mutual respect, and religious liberty. Let people live their lives. And I'm sorry, but only one party kind of believes in that right now. And we've got to preserve that. Anyone else like to have anything as we close? We're close to 7 o'clock. Jack, B, Charles, anybody like to say anything else?
The only thing I'll add, David, is that if you're true to your values, and I hope we try to be at Interfaith Alliance. I certainly know that everyone on this panel is. If we're true to our values, we're not interested just in winning the election. We're interested in winning the hearts of the country, so that even the people who don't vote the way that we do, or don't agree with the way that we do, that we think, are still protected under the constitutional guarantees of freedom of conscience. I too often don't perceive that there's room for dissent on the other side. And I would,
Amen.
I would fight with the same passion and fervor for the rights of people who believe differently than I do, as I will for people who agree with me, both in terms of my faith commitments and in terms of my political and American commitments. And I think that is one of the bright lines that divides so many people seeking higher office today.
Thank you, Jack. B and Charles, you want to add anything at the end? No, shaking your heads. Well, one, thank you for being here. I thank you for taking the time. You know, we don't get a lot of folks attending this, but then it goes on Facebook and I look and it says 25,000 views. Well, that makes a difference, people.
Yes.
It makes a huge difference. So thank you. Charles, you unmuted. Say something.
I just wanted to say thanks for having me on. I appreciate you.
Well, Charles, when I asked Charles, he said, you know, I sometimes vote for Republicans. And I said, Charles, I do too.
Me too.
I used to say I'm the least partisan county chair in Texas because our state representative, Drew Darby, is a champion of religious, of public education. Right. And I always vote for Drew. I mean, I make a point to make sure I vote for Drew. I made a point as county chair to make sure nobody ran against Drew because he's champion of public education. But the issue is there's about 10 Drew Garbys and 100 nutcases that run for public office now in the Republican Party. And Drew's not that. And you know that, Charles. And we got to get back to where there are people that respect each other and try to work together, or we're never going to get anywhere in this country. And yes, I have fits of anger. I told somebody the other day I wanted to write an article that says, you know how you know a racist white supremacist moved in your neighborhood, they put up a Trump flag. Well, my son said, Dad, don't do that because my sons are better or smarter than I am. And I understand that. That's wrong. I just get God every time I drive by one of those things, I want to throw up. But the reality is there are a lot of folks that are willing to work together. We've got to find them. We've got to pull them out. We've got to save this country from extremism. And right now, the Democratic Party is the best option we've got to do that. So thank you all for being on. Thank you all for sharing your heart. We're going to do this again October 6th. Marv Knox is going to be with us. Marv Knox is with CBF Southwest Fellowship. Marv has been very active down on the border, and you're going to hear about what's happened on the border and the kids that have been put in cages and separated from their parents. And there is nothing godly about that kind of behavior that's been happening in our country. So please come back October 6th, 6 o'clock. Hear from Bill Jones, my friend who took my place at Baptist Committed. Hear from Marv